Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Hey guys, what's up? It's Ryan from Team Made Apart. Well, this is it. Episode 12, the conclusion of the inaugural season of the Team Made Apart podcast. I'd like to personally thank each and every guest who took a chance on our show in this first season, and also to each and every one of the many thousands who've downloaded the show over the course of the past 12 weeks. Despite the fact that our world has gone from remote work as a subject to be considered to remote work as a subject to be overcome in the blink of an eye, the information shared by our experts over the tenure of this season has no doubt aided those struggling in these crazy times, and the perennial nature of the subjects and content will no doubt continue to serve those in need as our world transitions into the new normal, whatever that looks like. In closing, thank you all again for your ongoing support, and I look forward to seeing you all in August for Season 2. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and keep your eye on teammadeapart.com for some exciting announcements in the coming days and weeks.
Before we get started, as always, today's show is brought to you by teammadeapart.com. Team Made Apart features articles, tools, and resources designed to teach remote workers and those who hire them how to work better together. A community for owners, managers, leaders, freelancers, contractors, and all variety of remote worker. Team Made Apart is also a terrific resource for companies interested in implementing remote work policies in otherwise co-located environments, or for those planning to build fully distributed organizations from the jump. Listeners of this podcast have an exciting opportunity to get involved in the remote work revolution. In light of current events related to the coronavirus pandemic and a sudden worldwide shift to remote work, we're offering a free remote work best practices guide for leaders who find themselves struggling to create a remote work policy in a pinch. Now, and for the duration of the crisis, visit teammadeapart.com/crisis to not only download your free Team Made Apart Remote Policy Primer, how to write remote work policies that don't suck, but to find other tools and resources to help you weather the storm. Great working relationships make for great remote work experiences, and with this free guide, you'll be better equipped to do your part in creating and maintaining a happy and sustainable remote life. Once again, to take advantage of this collection of useful resources, please visit teammadeapart.com/crisis, that is teammadeapart.com/crisis, to download your free Best Practices Guide. One more thing before we kick off the show. Now, and for the foreseeable future, teammadeapart.com is offering free support and advice to remote workers and remote leaders alike through Team Made Apart Open Office. From noon to 2 p.m. Mountain Time, Monday through Friday, you can visit teammadeapart.com and navigate to the bottom left-hand corner of the page where you'll find a chat icon. Simply click it and you'll be connected to a real, remote work expert who is happy to help you solve problems in real time at no charge to you. Of course, you can use the same tool 24/7, 365 to ask questions or request services, but during open office hours, you've got a direct line of communication to people who care and people who can help. Once again, from noon to 2 p.m. Mountain Time, Monday through Friday, simply navigate to teammadeapart.com, find our chat icon in the bottom left-hand corner of the page, then click for instant support when you need it at no cost to you. Take advantage of this special program while it lasts, and now, back to the show.
Today's special guest is my friend and yours, Greene. Ali is a digital nomad, remote work advocate, and founder of Kohana.io. Her mission is to educate, inspire, and engage teams to create efficient, effective, and innovative frameworks for the future of work, regardless of where or what their office looks like. She does this by public speaking, appearing on podcasts, and contributing to numerous other activities in and around the remote workspace. Here to talk about building communities, being intentional, bridging gaps between humans and technology, and so much more, join me in welcoming our guest, Greene. Hey, Ali, thanks so much for doing the show. We're so glad to have you here. You're one of the few people who I'm most excited to have back here on the show. You and I have had the opportunity to talk a few times since meeting, and I don't know, now I feel like we're old buddies. So I'm really grateful for having you on here to talk about remote work and all the pleasures therein.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ryan. I'm also very excited to be talking about remote work. It's one of the things I'm most passionate about. So it's awesome to have this opportunity to chat about it.
Yeah. Well, so I guess in the spirit of remote work, where are you calling in from today?
I'm calling in today from Detroit, where it is snowing like crazy outside, but in a few days I'll be headed to sunny Miami. So always on the go.
Oh, that'll be awesome. Well, and that might be maybe a good place to start. I mean, let's talk a little bit about your background and how you got into this whole mess. Like, what are you doing in this space?
Yeah, that sounds great. So I professionally have always had a background in startups. And what was most interesting to me about the startup scene is really just companies questioning the status quo. And as someone who works in people operations and thinks a lot about company culture, I saw so many companies question the status quo of industries and products, but it was only until recently until people began questioning why offices exist, why people have to sit in the same chair every day in order to have great ideas and be productive. And that never felt like something that I could get behind personally. And so I always joke that I traded in Madison Avenue for Machu Picchu because it was a very like somewhat cliche way of starting my nomad journey, but I was living that very traditional Manhattan life, commuting from Brooklyn to Manhattan on a train that took over an hour every day to get into a desk by 8 a.m. to do work that I really enjoyed, but really started to lose my passion because the New York grind was just getting me down. And I'm someone who throughout my life had moved quite frequently. I was born in Detroit, which is where I'm calling in from today. I went to school in Canada. I studied in Ireland. I backpacked South America. So I had all these travel experiences. And I remember thinking how inspired I was when I was on the road and how much my brain was just always on in those foreign experiences because I had to problem solve personally. And solving problems like how do I speak this language and figure out the bus schedule in a foreign country really easily could translate to how do I solve this business problem. And so I started to question why life existed in office spaces and was able to start working remotely and traveling. And I did it a little bit by myself before joining a company where I was their director of people operations. And at that point in time, I was working full time and traveling full time. And so for the past 4 years, I've been in Asia, Africa, Europe, all while growing this company from 30 people to 90 people. And then recently have taken all of those experiences to launch my own remote work consultancy business, Kohana, with a goal of really helping other remote workers and remote companies be able to create communities online and give people the flexibility to live a life that matters to them. So for me, it means traveling the world. For other people, it could just mean better times to go grocery shopping because they don't have to do that Sunday night struggle. And the options are really endless when it comes to remote work.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great. Thanks for all that. And I think maybe one thing we should try and maybe point out specifically, and it's such an interesting thing. And in fact, I didn't even recognize the difference until I myself got into sort of this remote work space. But can we talk a little bit about sort of the differences in remote workers? So in your case, as it sounds from your story, you're largely more nomadic. You would be this character called a digital nomad or whatever else
Yeah.
they call you. But many remote workers aren't that. And it's funny because for my whole career, I mean, basically the last 20 years, I've been calling myself a remote work or a digital nomad because I was nomadic and I worked largely via digital platforms, right? So I put it all together. But there really is a distinction between your traditional remote worker, somebody who's just trying to work from home or work from a non-co-located location, and somebody who's a digital nomad. Can you talk a little bit about that just so that we can sort of set these definitions for people who were lost like I was?
Yeah, definitely. I think before you even get to the definitions of each individual, there's like a lot of different definitions people are using to talk through companies. And so you have remote companies, and within that can be remote first oriented companies. So companies that do have co located offices but offer some sort of remote option or flexibility. I think there's distributed offices where there's hubs that are, the classic of oh, there's a San Francisco and a New York office, but how do those two offices interact with each other does create some sort of remote communication as well. And then there's completely remote companies. So no office and people just choose to work from home or wherever is most convenient from them. So depending on the type of company that exists, and it's funny because now even more traditional companies, I have some friends that work in the legal industry, which in my mind is like one of the most traditional industries in the US, are offering work from home days for their employees. So learning how to work remotely and learning how to be part of the remote work environment, I think is just going to continue to grow and be important for people to have those skills. But depending on the type of person, as you mentioned, it could be very different. So work from home traditionally is a person who has a home office set up or a dedicated space that they can work from instead of commuting into an office. And they're primarily located in the same place and go to the same office space to work, whether it's in their home or in a local co-working space. But it's primarily driven by being part of one community and not necessarily traveling. I think you have part-time digital nomads as well, so people that have a traditional home base and work from home sometimes, but then also travel and tack on a couple of weeks of working while they're traveling with a couple of weeks of vacation, for example. And then there are people like me. You've heard the term digital nomad. Another one is location independent, which I think is a great umbrella term for all of these types of people, um, where I work online and therefore I've decided that my work from home means wherever I currently am in the world. And so I'll spend anywhere from 2 weeks to about 2 months in different countries and work from co-working spaces or cafes or my Airbnb and experience local life as much as possible, just in an always changing environment.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think it's, I mean, one of the things I'll try and avoid is really trying to, I guess, pigeonhole somebody or define them by the characteristics of their remote work. But I do think it's important to share that. I think it's, you don't want to define these people necessarily, though, sort of is akin to this idea that remote work isn't just work, like it's just work. It's not a perk of work, it's just work. And I think that happens sometimes with, by calling somebody a digital nomad or something, that can bring with it some connotation. And so I really like your idea of this location independent thing. I think that's a much better way to describe people that are sort of able to freely float and are being more measured by their success at work versus, where they happen to be located.
Yeah, and what I love about the location independent terminology is it really goes to show that people are making independent choices, not just in what they're doing for work, but also how they choose to set up their professional and personal life. And so some of the types of people that I get really inspired by are people that are choosing to live in rural communities where they might not have had job opportunities to work on certain projects. And then because of remote work, they can work on these really challenging and interesting projects online, be talent that is a great find for a company, and then choose to opt out of city life and reinvigorate cities that may not have had population growth in the past few years, might have been forgotten about, reconnect with nature. So I think that's like a really interesting segment of kind of remote work life that is interesting to me if I wasn't traveling. And then I'm just always amazed by people that have overcome difficulties in their life and how remote work has helped with that. So whether it's physical or mental disabilities or taking care of an elderly parent or a child and being able to meet all of those personal obligations while still doing a really great job at their work and not having to sacrifice their career for things that are really important to them personally is something I really admire about the remote movement.
Yeah, no, I think it's amazing. And it's funny because, as a relative newcomer to the formal version of remote work advocacy or whatever we're calling it, this, it's funny when you don't it's funny that you don't know what you don't know kind of thing. Is in that, there's so many of these different aspects of life that when you explain it, just like you did, a person maybe with a disability or a person taking care of somebody could leverage remote work as a way to elevate their lives. Like, it's kind of a no-brainer now that I happen to be in this space, but it's funny how much of that stuff wasn't part of the stereotype that I had built around remote workers, right? And so it's I think it's really important to share that kind of information and let people understand, because opening up this perception that remote work can be used for a number of reasons, a reasons that might benefit the company, but b lots of personal reasons, I think is really important, because I think sometimes you do get bogged down with like the photos of the guy with his toes in the beach with the laptop, and and it kind of like hyper glamorizes it. And not to say that that stuff doesn't exist. I've worked from Puerto Vallarta on the beach and done my thing before, but I mean,
I definitely have a few of those pictures as well.
Right.
Like working on a beach, or I worked at an ice cream shop once that had Wi-Fi and just like went to town on different ice cream sundaes. So I've had my fair of like
Yeah.
really weird
Well,
work locations.
yeah, and I think that that's great, and I think that's like one end of the spectrum, right? But I think when it always looks so glamorous, it's almost like the Instagram version of remote work, right? It's everything starts to feel unattainable because every 26-year-old has a yacht in my timeline. So it's like I don't understand how come I can't compete. Where same thing, maybe I have a family, and so I can't travel around and be as nomadic as somebody who maybe doesn't have that. And so maybe I count myself out of remote work because I can't go be on a beach somewhere. And so I think it is important to sort of share these stories or sort of think about all these different angles. And I think, it really helps to frame the conversation around the idea of how remote work as a thing can benefit people, and sort of really focus on sort of a people first approach to remote work.
Yeah, and what I love about that is that yes, it's people first, but it always does trickle back to companies. So from an entrepreneur's point of view, I think a lot of the benefits around remote work, hiring talent from anywhere and having a larger talent pool, reducing costs because you no longer have an office, like sure, yes, those things are great, but also if you offer up the ability for people to make their own choices and hire them because they care and stand behind your company's mission, they will be, not only is it people first for their personal life, but it's a holistic benefit because if those people are able to take care of the things they need to do personally, they won't be distracted at work. So when they do work, they're hyper focused to getting a job done. They're interacting with the world, so they're getting inspiration from all over and learning best practices from different industries that could be applied to their work and their role. They're genuinely just like happier and potentially healthier if they're sleeping better or finding out the best time of day where they're motivated to exercise versus motivated to sit behind a laptop and work. And all of those things do help the companies become more successful as well. So I think it can be a very healthy relationship by helping people own their life and own their time. Everybody wins.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think so much of that, and I've been having this conversation a lot lately, this idea of sort of intention setting. And as a business or as an employer, if you decide to start venturing into remote work, or maybe you have some level of remote work policy or nothing at all, but you're considering growing it or making it more complete, it really is important to make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Doing it for savings in real estate, might be a practical application or a practical reason for doing something like this. But, to keep this sort of people first idea going, it's that idea that you're doing this for the betterment of your employees, to make life better for your employees. And then all the trickle down will happen. But I think setting your intention in the wrong spot, focusing it on real estate savings versus, other people, might be the wrong way to get into this. And
Yes,
so, yeah, so I kind
definitely.
of wondered, in your prior work experience, a big part of what you did was like in implementing these people first ideas and start connecting those dots and building communities and things like that. I wondered if you wouldn't talk a little bit about your experience, in sort of a corporate environment and, trying to sort of install these sorts of sensibilities within the company. Now, I just happen to know that your former employer was a fully remote, fully, completely not detached, completely something company.
Distributed, yes.
Distributed. They shouldn't both start with a D. Yes, they're a fully distributed company, and so they probably went into it with some mindset characteristics that are probably more in the right spot than maybe a company, an older business that's trying to adapt. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think just in terms of the intention setting, what it really boils down to is not just what is our company culture, which I think is incredibly important for remote or not remote companies, like having a clear mission and values. Um, they're the baseline of any business, but taking it a step forward, what I think is really important for the next generation of businesses, and you see this a lot in remote businesses, and it's something that I've helped curate and develop over my time at my previous company, was how the company becomes a community. And it's not the same as company culture, because when you're talking about community, you're talking about things like what are the rules of engagement between two employees? How do those rules of engagement change if those two employees are on different teams or different levels of the organization, or one person has been there longer than the other. Like, what does that change in terms of what the norms are? And so I think what's really important when it comes to developing a company as a community in order to be successful remotely is to think through, what are our norms? What do we expect of all of our people? How can we define things clearly, especially if it's a company? And this was the case at DuckDuckGo, which is where I was the director of people operations. We had people from, maybe 13 different countries. So like, what are the countries' cultures of what are expected behaviors and behavioral norms versus the company's behavioral norms, and how do you merge those two? And I think having clear definitions of various things to make sure there's no room for people bringing their own interpretation in is a really important step. And so one of the things that I did in my time there was really working through, what are the expectations if you are a career advisor? What are the expectations if you're an independent contributor? How do those expectations turn into actions that you can take? And so, really boiling it down, checklists, templates, things like that became my best friend in terms of creating process, because it removes the guesswork for remote people, and they know, hey, I have this tool that can help me get all of my ideas out, and it's consistent for everybody. And so it will help us save time in understanding what knowledge needs to be transferred.
Yeah, no, I think you make a great distinction in there too. This idea, or the sort of the difference between culture and, I guess, policy, because I think so many people, when they start thinking about remote work and we want to get into this, they think of it as a cultural move, right? We are culturally accepting of people who work remotely or out of house, but I don't think that they often think about it in this way, where I think we're so used to running businesses the way we run businesses in sort of traditional ways that we don't it's not easy to get into the headspace of doing that kind of work for a remote worker, unless you happen to work from home or whatever on your own. I think so many people's corporate policy as it pertains to remote work is, yeah, you can go home a couple days this week, or you've got a sick kid, you can stay home. I don't think they're thinking about sort of the longer term implications and how, all by defining clearly all this stuff, the same way you would a mission statement or whatever else, by having these really finite and granular details, really sort of fill in the gaps. I think your remote workers end up being much happier. You end up with a much more productive team, and you don't run into some of the problems that you might otherwise encounter.
Yeah, and I think a lot of leaders at remote companies, from my conversations, are sometimes nervous about how much of these behavioral norms to document for fear of becoming micromanaging or not giving people the flexibility that the goal of remote work provides. But I think having these expectations very clearly laid out helps create boundaries so people know where they can make alterations in their life, how they can make decisions that are important to them without needing to second guess themselves or spend time really going through the different scenarios. So things like, as a remote company, do you expect people to overlap any amount of hours of the day? That's a decision that leadership can make that will impact a behavioral norm and impact how the community engages with each other. Because if it's yes, then there's more opportunity for impromptu synchronous conversations. There's more of an opportunity to collaborate in real time if that's going to be beneficial to the business. The downside of that is it does give people less flexibility to do things outside of work or schedule their day, especially if you're hiring people that are quite dispersed from a time zone perspective. On the flip side to that, you could say it is part of the community norms that there are no set office hours and it's just get your work done whenever, wherever. Well, that's really great then for the personal flexibility. The business challenges that you might have to overcome is less room for spontaneous synchronous meetings. So it might mean that you have more scheduled stand-ups or you move to a fully like asynchronous model for some decision making projects. And so I think the more leaders start asking themselves these questions and deciding, like, do I want choice A or do I want choice B, knowing the pros and cons, they can start to share that information with the leaders in their organization, with the independent contributors in the organization, to provide the necessary repetition for those behaviors to become what is expected of them.
Yeah, I think that's so smart, and I think it does really help to sort of show a couple different examples like that. How, setting yourself in one way is more positive for certain aspects. Because it really is this balancing act, right? And so much about remote work is that it's balancing sort of technology versus relationship versus productivity versus, I guess, quote unquote happiness, or whatever you want to call this flexibility or freedom. And so there's so many things to factor in, and you're right, it is kind of an individual choice. So, and not that there's like any one thing. One aspect of this, however, that I wanted to talk with you a little bit about specifically, because I know you have experience in this, is the sort of the human interaction component of this. So I think a lot of times, especially for people new to remote work or companies that are just starting to get into it, they start maybe first looking at the technological solutions. Like, okay, well, we need to get a Slack subscription, and we need to get blah blah blah. Get 3 or 4 different pieces of software that will sort of facilitate the interpersonal communication. And I think that a lot of people, maybe their initial train of thought before they really start digging into this stops there, right? It's like, I just need to facilitate work at a distance, not so much how do we really take care of the, the squishy stuff, the warm, fuzzy feeling stuff. And, so many remote workers are subject to isolation and separation anxieties and problems like this that come from just being independent. And I think it's really important to sort of address those people things. And one way that they do this is that most remote companies still come together on occasion, whether it's for kickoffs or maybe strictly social. But there's one reason or another that people still get together. And so despite all this great advancement in technology, there's still a human component here. And so I wonder if you talk a little bit about sort of the how and when to meet, and then the why. Like, why is it important that we do that?
Yeah, so I'll start backwards. I'll start with the why, then get into the nitty gritty details. I think that a lot of the things that you said really stand out to me. Think about putting all of this energy into developing your strategy around your tools. You're really excited. You get your Slack channel up and running, and it's crickets, and people don't know like what they're supposed to talk about, or if they should use the emojis, like what is okay, what looks professional, what doesn't look professional. Or you get it and all of a sudden it's just like chaos of information, and then people have so much to read through that they aren't getting their work done, or they feel really overwhelmed and don't know what's important to read. So there's two extremes there. And again, like, not to sound like a broken record, probably only halfway through our conversation, but it all comes down to what are the expectations? Like, how should people interact in this tool? And that's not a decision based off the tool. It is a decision based off of the human component. And so I think first and foremost, thinking through the human component is hugely important. There was a study that was just released by, I believe it was Buffer and AngelList, that did a remote work survey. And 20% of people in that survey said that communication and collaboration was a struggle for them. And 20% of people said loneliness was a struggle for them. These are common statistics that we hear with remote work. And both of them can be solved by investing time for people to meet face to face. So remote work's great. We just spent, a few minutes, probably more than that, talking about how awesome remote work is. Remote work, in my mind, isn't a replacement for humans being humans. And so biologically and naturally, like, humans are wired for connection. And when we spend time with people, we form a bond with them that really helps breed trust. It helps breed vulnerability. It helps people understand what are the weird quirks about this person that doesn't shine through with the loss of like tone when you're just writing things asynchronously to each other. And so the benefits of in-person retreats is just that. It's really taking a group of people to the next level and helping them form a true team. And so spending time with each other And we can talk about the strategies of what to do once you get that time in place, I think is hugely important just because it really elevates the human experience of working with someone. And naturally, if you like someone, you want to help them. And so if you like your coworkers, you want to help them, which helps the company. And so that's where all of the great warm and fuzzies come into play. Um,
Well, I think you just made an interesting point too. Going back to what you were saying about your prior employer having a really detached team, people all over the planet from a number of different cultural backgrounds and things like that. How did you deal with sort of bridging some of those cultural gaps? There are I don't know. I guess they're gross stereotypes, but I mean, maybe the shoe fits in some of these cases. And there's at least a little bit of you know, difference in the way that cultures react to one another. And maybe it's less pronounced in something like a written communication, but little things like maybe one group of people prefer to be called on versus raising their hands, where another group of people require more follow-up than others, and there's like all these different like little things. How did you guys bridge sort of this communication gap between different parts of the world?
yeah, I think first and foremost, showcasing and having the leaders lead by example on what communication styles made the most sense. Um, and so that is where having a clear cadence for content became important. So things like weekly updates are expected of you. And this is the type of content that should be included in a weekly update. So people start to see that over time. And regardless of their culture, they know, okay, I need to be proactive enough to, at a minimum, do communication once a week. In that, I need to be honest enough to share if nothing got done and why, and there's not going to be any repercussions there, that this type of content is always included in this. To ask for help, I think, is like a common thing where people never really know how to do that, and it's really easy to hide behind a computer screen. So making it not only okay to ask for help, but celebrated to ask for help and showing people how they can do that is really important. And then in terms of cultural tension, um, the philosophy of most respectful interpretation. So you read something, it doesn't feel good. You don't really know why it doesn't feel good. Assume the person wasn't trying to be a jerk. Assume that they were really just trying to write their thoughts down fast, or they were trying to be as short as possible so you didn't have a lot of stuff to read through. And once you go at it from that angle, it kind of removes this natural defensiveness you have and instead creates a bridge for you to ask questions. So, hey, why did you share that information in that way? What was your thought process behind XYZ? Have you thought about doing it like this instead? Those types of questions help bridge the gap and get to a point of clear understanding. I think all of that stuff can be done virtually, but then having the time to do that in person, another benefit of these in-person retreats is understanding the subtleties behind the things like tone, jokes, um, what makes people kind of give you that look of like, oh, I'm a little uncomfortable, and then you know that it's not okay, or yeah, I'm super blunt and you can just like give me the truth without sugarcoating it. I think you kind of get that from spending time with people and seeing how they react and how they just casually banter with each other. Um, Whether you're in person or not, you can carve out time to casually banter.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's an important thing too. Like, I mean, to understand those cultural differences, but to also treat people as individuals versus sort of applying some cultural stereotype. I know, for example, in parts of sort of middle to northern Europe, they maybe are forthcoming with sort of personal issues when they're at work. They want to talk about professional matters and leave personal life at home. But maybe in southern countries there in Europe, like Spain and Italy and places like this, where they have this sort of Latin culture, they really want to get to know you on a personal level. They want to understand personal things, and so the banter in that part of the world might be different. But you could see how the interaction between, let's say, a German guy and a Spanish guy, could create some, there's some range there that we're trying to overcome, or some gap that we're trying to bridge. So I think you mentioned some really good solutions to that.
Yeah. And just in terms of that, it's, there's ways that introverts and extroverts in the same country misunderstand each other. So really taking that personal approach is the most effective way, I think, to communicate successfully with someone. I do this thing, the people kickoff, where you sit down with someone if you've never worked with them before, and you share, like, this is how I like to be communicated with. These are sort of things that in communication professionally might make me feel insecure, or these are like trigger words for me. And just start having that conversation from the get-go. This is how much I want to chat about my personal life. I like talking at the beginning of calls and getting to know you personally, or I'm really task driven. I want to do the meeting agenda points, and if we have extra time, let's hang out and talk. It sounds really weird, I think, for most people to get that specific, but when you're working remotely, to be able to get that specific from the get-go removes a lot of guesswork.
Yeah, no, and I think it's sort of a recurring theme in a lot of the things you're talking about, right? The more defined your processes are, the more defined your policies are, the more clearly articulated the expectations. It almost can overcome some of these cultural differences, right? As long as everybody's on the same page that there will be a weekly email, there will be a blah, 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 and we all have sort of these, same 5 steps, no matter where you live, regardless of your cultural inclinations, this is what's expected of you as part of that job. And it sort of can maybe help level the playing field a little bit. So
Definitely.
yeah, and because it's interesting, so you cited the buffer study, I think it's in the 2020 State of Remote report that they published. They cite this 20% loneliness, and like you said, in just about every survey on the subject, loneliness is way up there. But what's interesting about that particular survey is there's another 20%, so the other big nugget in that thing is collaboration and communication. And it's interesting how collaboration and communication and loneliness are so interweaved. Really, that's 40% of the pie, but great communication and collaboration could overcome a lot of that loneliness. And so I think it's interesting how the two are sort of at the top of the heap there. So, but I think that by implementing these policies and making sure that we're clear and articulate about the way that we expect things to get done, you could almost, I don't know, mush those into one topic and really move the needle quite far on the sort of the state of remote.
Yeah, I agree. And we keep going back to ways you can do that before you spend time with someone in real life. And I think there are so many small things you can do related to processes, related to activities that you sanction as a company, as activities worth your time remotely, like spending those extra 10, 15 minutes on a call to just get to know each other. But the one piece that I was excited about before we went off on this tangent was just because you're remote doesn't mean that you should be remote forever. And so going back to, you asked, like, how often should people meet up in person? What are the reasons people should meet up in person? I think that any time where those things like communication, collaboration are in jeopardy, or anytime you feel like the people that you're interacting with are getting to the point of isolation, that those are triggers that means it's a good time to meet up. Most companies, like, as a best practice, meet up at least once a year with their whole company. I've seen twice a year in certain circumstances. A lot of companies also offer smaller retreats for just teams to meet up and spend time with each other. I would expand that pie and offer a few other reasons why I think companies should meet up, which is outside of a whole company meetup. Anytime a cross functional project is going to get going that's going to have a major impact on a company objective, meeting up in person to get all the stakeholders on the same page, to be able to brainstorm, get that energy behind the project and roadmap out the different pieces that people are going to own, I think is a really cool, interesting way to use the idea of in-person time to have an investment at the front end of something that's going to be longstanding, and then see it continue to grow remotely. I also think, as we talk about isolation especially, yes, meeting up with your direct teammates is awesome. There's a lot of reasons why that's a great thing to do. But what about meeting up with other people in the company that you don't particularly work with very frequently, just to create friendships and more of a bond to each other and to the company's mission and objective? How often are remote companies missing that spontaneous coffee or kitchen chat, where really cool inspiration comes from, or you uncover frustrations that other teams are facing as well, and then you're able to take a step back and find a solution for it? And so I think just having opportunities for people to meet up, whether graphical areas, whether they have similar interests outside of work and want to spend time with each other, and half work, half vacation. There's a lot of creative ways, again, to continue to blend the person first perspective of how do we make sure that the time is enjoyable but also efficient.
Yeah, what I like about what you brought up, or at least one aspect of it, is that I think it's important to be, I guess, more proactive, right? And put these groups together and get people some real, like, in, real FaceTime, not via FaceTime, on occasion, but for reasons of like practical business matters. Like, so this idea of getting together because you've got some critical project coming up or something, versus the idea of waiting until, we know everybody gets a little restless about 6 months in and we need to have a retreat. I like the
Yeah.
idea of doing it for positive reason rather than trying to stave off some kind of problem. And I think by being proactive, maybe meeting more regularly, or like you said, on a team basis versus a entire company get together or whatever, I think these opportunities, more frequent, can be sort of a proactive solution to avoiding the things like the loneliness and stuff like that. I sort of look at a lot of these different communication channels, sort of like, we're filling a glass of water, right? And a Slack or a text message might be like a drop or two, where a maybe video call is like, I don't know, a few ounces of water or something like that. And I feel like all these things are really great, in terms of trying to fight some loneliness, and that we're having communication and we're talking. But I will almost always say, I mean, even as great as like this conversation has been with you by a Zoom, by a remote, if we were having the same conversation over coffee someplace, like, it would just be, whatever percentage better. Maybe it's just a couple little something, a few more drops better, but it's still better, right? This idea that, looking into a person's eyes, reading body language, things like that, some of the things that aren't as apparent in video. And so I sort of look at it that way, right? So if all these little touch points that we have over the course of our normal workday are contributing to this glass of water we're filling, eventually you sort of need that in-person something to kind of put it over the top, right? And so I think that, being proactive in that space and making sure that it is part of your policy, it's something that's articulated in your policy, and it's something that as a company you fully support and embrace, I think will translate to, great relationships among the people working for you.
Yeah, definitely. And not just part of the policy, but having clearly defined budgets, or at least expectations around how much the company is comfortable spending for this type of investment in their people, will, I think, encourage people to take advantage of it, because planning a retreat doesn't have to cost a company, crazy amount of money. There are very affordable ways to get people together to spend quality time with one another. And so being creative about how you're structuring that time, I think, is also important, because it is an investment that you're not getting otherwise.
Let's maybe use that then as a segue to sort of complete this trilogy of thought around this, idea of corporate retreats and when and how and why you should get together. I think we, beat the why into the ground. We have lots of evidence for why we should do it, but how do we do it effectively? Whether it's cost savings or not, but how do we make the most of these events?
Yeah, the format that I like when I think about logistically how to start planning a retreat goes back to making sure that everybody understands what is the goal of the retreat, because that might really change the dynamic that you're trying to achieve. And so if you start with what are the goals, what types of shared experiences are people hoping for, and how can we create an experience for them to bond with one another, it can help you really understand logistical questions that can be solved. So obviously you need to pick a time and pick a place, um, But even picking a place, some people are more comfortable traveling than others, making sure that you're choosing locations that are isolated enough that people can spend time with one another, but have enough going on that they can enjoy the inspiration from the environment, I think is incredibly important. And what is appropriate in terms of your company norms in traveling? Do you want people to travel on weekends in order to make the retreat? Is it going to be a week long? Are you trying to squeeze it into a Monday, Friday cadence? Will all limit the scope of what's available to a company. So I think thinking through all of those details, I'm a huge proponent, and I'm working on currently building out resources off the shelf for this, of a survey for all of the people attending the retreat to get those types of questions answered will help shape the types of retreats that are best for employees, or groups of people coming together to work. And so I think the buckets that need to be figured out when planning a retreat are things like logistics, date, time. Also, do you want to stay in an Airbnb and have a really more intimate experience with your colleagues or the people that you're working on a team with? Again, kind of goes back to the original options I shared of there's pros and cons to that. The pros being you really get to see each other, have that first coffee in the morning and joke around and talk about what remote work looks like when you're just home and you're on your own. There's a lot more opportunity for impromptu conversations around the business and a lot more opportunity for people to just casually get to know each other. The cons, if you have a very introverted team or if your team is bringing their families along, privacy can become somewhat of an issue for people that need their space at the end of their day and really value their alone time. So really understanding your people to decide, am I going an Airbnb route? Do I need a hotel block? What are the different reasons why I would choose that? So it's not really just about cost. While cost will change between a hotel and an Airbnb, it's also about the intention behind why you want to do something. Are you going to be in a city? Do you want to be more in the rural countryside? How much of your regular work do you want to get done, versus how much of it is just going to be focused on the theme of the retreat? Are all logistical questions to answer. Time of the day that you're working versus how many breaks people get is something that I think is heavily overlooked when planning retreats for remote companies. It's sort of weird that from what I've seen, remote companies are really progressive about work hours until you're all in the same room. And then they're like, oh, we can do meetings from 9 to 5. And it's like, well, do you actually need to do those meetings from 9 to 5? What if you have the whole morning to just spend with each other and relax, and you do meetings from 2 to 6? And what does that look like for the retreat? So those are questions that seem maybe silly to some people listening or obvious, but each of those decisions carries a weight behind it. And once you get all of that figured out, content is key. Don't forget to plan the content ahead of time, or at least figure out the structure of the content. Do you want to do mastermind sessions? Are you having a brainstorm? Who from the community can teach certain people about certain topics? Who are the subject matter experts in the group? Are you doing it all together, or are you bringing in external people to share knowledge with the group? Planning the logistics takes a lot of time, and you can have perfect logistics, but then you're all going to get there and look at each other, and that's not the benefit of retreats. So I think you need to spend equal time thinking about how content will be executed as you do all the logistics.
Well, I think that's a good observation because, basically, it's a retreat, but it's still work. And so it does make sense to make sure that you're working towards some objectives, even if your objective is just social time.
Mhm.
Whatever your objective is, to make sure that you've actually thought through that and understood what it is you're going for. I think, getting everybody together, not only is it because of the expense, but it's such a tremendous opportunity to build relationships and things like that, that you would really be remiss to not give it proper credence or spend enough time thinking about what to do with it.
Yeah.
Because, it's just such a critical time.
If anything, the 3 questions I would always ask the people attending the retreat would be, what do you want to learn about during this time together? What can you share with the group? And reminds them that it does not have to be strictly work related. And what topics are you most interested in discussing in real life? And I think if you ask those 3 questions, that you'll be able to plan a retreat that satisfies everybody's needs and expectations.
Well, and I think that's great too, even just the idea of making it somewhat collaborative, this idea of your retreat, right? At least in my experience, and I don't know if this is the case everywhere, I don't have that much to build on, but in my experience, a lot of these corporate events that I've gone to, corporate meetings and retreats and things like that, it's typically sort of top down, mandated by the company. It's going to be X, Y, and Z. It is meetings all day or conferences or breakout sessions or whatever. And, and it's basically work. You're not working at work, but you're, at a hotel somewhere. And
Yeah.
so, but I like this idea, and I don't know if it's unique to remote work or if it's maybe more prevalent in sort of more modern companies, younger companies, tech startups, and things like that. This idea of having this more collaborative, interactive event. But I think that that's an interesting thing that even a more established or an older or more traditional company could really take into mind to try to make the most out of their events and their time to get together, whether co-located or not. Like, I think it's just a good way to approach putting this kind of thing together.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess if you want to, let's talk a little bit more about just sort of the uh, the bridging of sort of the human and technology gaps a little bit. We've talked about in-person meetings and conferences as one, but I wonder if, just as somebody who's so nomadic and clearly doesn't have like a set team, how much of your social time is put together via teammate versus how much of it do you go to work but maybe you just go meet a buddy for coffee? Like, how much responsibility is it of the company to be providing for your social needs versus you as somebody who's much more nomadic than others? How do you sort of, I guess, balance that out?
Yeah, I think that companies finding ways to support their people, whether they're nomadic like me or they already have an integrated community with them at home, it's in their benefit to help people find community. I think there's this old world way of thinking that a company community is only focused inside work. Who are your coworkers? Who are the people you're seeing on a regular basis? And that's kind of all they cared about or thought about. Um, I think this new way that is emerging is, how do I help the people that I'm employing find ways that are useful for them to spend their time, that will have some sort of shared characteristics for what they want to learn, or the same functional area of expertise that is available to them. Um, I think there's a lot of that responsibility that boils down to each individual, but cool things that I've seen companies do to support those initiatives are things like co-working benefits for people, whether they're nomadic or just have a co-working space in town, to be able to offset some of the costs to get those social interactions with people that aren't their coworkers, knowing how important that is when you're working from home or working virtually. Um, for me, I think about community in a way where I don't really like to separate my work community and my personal community. It's the same for everybody. I have recurring Zoom calls with some of my friends just to catch up, and I casually like text some of my colleagues about things we're watching on TV. And so for me, the lines are really blurred, and that's because I'm finding a way to cultivate relationships with people based on my core values and my interests. Really just by taking an inventory of my life and figuring out where the gaps were and what was missing, and figuring out how should my employer, or how would I recommend employers now that I would consult with, support their employees, whether it's sanctioned time off or financially, to participate in some of these things. And as an individual, how do you curate the right group of people that will satisfy the needs you have for yourself?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, right? It's such an individual thing. And I think that's one of the recurring themes in our conversation has been, despite all these policies and other things like that, so much of the care you need to take as an employer is, this individualized efforts that you need to take to sort of please the people around you. And I think it's really important that, in a sort of people first approach, that you would sort of at least attempt to do that. Maybe you can't be all things to all people, but at the same time, being intentional about the work you're doing and working hard to try and make sure that you're making a great experience for your team, I think is sort of the bread and butter there.
Yeah, and I think by knowing that people have individual needs, not necessarily trying to find a one size fit all, but creating various options is really important. And so, from a benefits and policies perspective, it could be you have an option of which benefit you want to participate in as a remote worker. Do you want a stipend for a home office because you don't necessarily need that social connection to your community and you just want to be really productive at home? Or do you want a recurring stipend to go out into the community and co-work with people? And so I think it would be really cool for companies to offer up choices, instead of trying to put, round pegs into square slots or whatever that metaphor is, or just not offering anything at all, or being hyper individual where people don't know what they're allowed to ask for. Finding out a way to create different options for people and then letting them choose, again, helps them feel really connected to the company and supported, and it does have that people first approach.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense, from a scaling position and trying to manage a lot of people position, it makes sense to have some structure. And so I like this suggestion of options, because you could sort of build that into your structure. So
Yeah,
even though it doesn't feel regimented because you have choice, it could still be something you could plan for and sort of design for your staff.
it's like one of those fast casual restaurants of like, do you want the bowl or the burrito? And then what fillings do you want? Like, do you want option A or option B? Sort of a choose your own adventure with how you're structuring your work.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great metaphor for this because it really is that, right? You have confines. Like, I mean, we can't do everything for everybody, but we can definitely, make some accommodations. And if you can have a little more beans and a little less meat or vice versa, and that makes you as an employee maybe a little more happy, or a little more satisfied with your employer. And as an employer, you're doing your part to make sure that you're addressing sort of human need. And
Exactly.
so, yeah, I think that's a great place to sort of cap this thing off. So let's go ahead and wind this thing down. Allie, where can people find out more about you, learn about the work you're doing as a consultant, and track you down online?
Yeah. So people that are interested in learning more about my remote work advocacy and consultancy can go to kohana.io. Or you can find me on LinkedIn, Allie Greene. For those that want to follow my nomadic lifestyle and see all of the ice cream shops I work out of, you can find me on Instagram. I'm Seeing Green with 1G.
All right, cool. Well, that's awesome. And thank you again so much, Allie, for making time to do this. We had tried to do it once and had to reschedule. I'm so grateful you came back. This has been an awesome conversation. I think there are a lot of useful information in here that people can take and run with. So thanks so much for your time.
It was great talking to you. Thank you.
I don't owe you anything. I don't owe you anything.